Hi everybody, how are you all today? It's lovely to be talking to you again. I hope you're all doing well during your lockdown. My hair's getting even more unmanageable than it was last week, and but I'm still here. I'm still hanging on there. Remember when we parted company last time? I said to you that next time we met, I'd start a little series called Connections, and it's about connections that people may have in the history of Scotland, that may have with literature, science, with you good people over in the United States. Who knows what I'll pull out of the bag for you. Well, our first one is about a very lovable, well, I think is a lovable rogue. He's one of my favourite rogues of Scotland, if not the UK, a man called Deacon Brodie, and his connection with the most amazing piece of literature that has ever been written. Now, Deacon Brodie, a deacon is a deacon of rights. That means that you're the head of your own particular guild of craftsmen. And William Brodie in the 18th century was the head of the Guild of Cabinet Makers. He was an extremely talented cabinet maker, as was his father and his grandfather before them. To have a piece of Brodie made furniture in Scotland would be like having a piece of Chippendale in England. That's the furniture, not the strippers. Now, you can, when you visit Edinburgh today, you can see in the Museum of Scotland a couple of pieces of Deacon Brodie and his workman's beautiful work. And you can also see a piece in the Writers' Museum as well, which is where our connection will be. Now, as I said, he's a deacon of rights, a very well respected man in his early 40s by the time we get to 1787. He's not a particularly good looking man by all accounts. I do have read in a few chronicles of him that he had a long scar down the side of his face, but I think what he had was charisma and the benefit of a lovely wardrobe. Now, we all know what a lovely wardrobe can make us look like, can't we? He did like clothes, lots of taffetas and silks and satins, all the latest fashions, beautiful powdered wigs. So he was an upright member of society, a pillar of society. You could almost see him holding the ceiling up. He was also on the town council, very much a respected man that people went to with their problems, any issues that they had. An all-round good egg, as we say here. He wasn't married, but there was a little bit of an edge to him. And that was that he led a double life. This respected man in the day became something very different at night time. At night time, he became a womanizer. He actually kept two mistresses on the Royal Mile, and a miracle to say, and it is, they didn't know about each other, even though both of them had children as well. They were completely oblivious to each other. When I lived in Edinburgh, even now as a guide, if I'm walking down with a walking tour in Edinburgh, I can't get down the Royal Mile without someone saying, "Hi Laura, you all right?" So how he kept this a secret, I don't know. A gambler, a drinker. It was an expensive life, keeping up a double life like this. I mean, he was quite wealthy in his own right, but, you know, the purse strings were tight. So his other nocturnal activity was burgling houses. He was a burglar. And I don't think really that he did it just for the money. I think he did it for the thrill as well. He did like to lead life by the seat of his pants. And when he went out to burgle, he wore a tricorn hat like a highwayman and a black mask across his eyes. He was all for the show. He was very flamboyant. He was a showman. Now, he was in a very lucky position because he held the keys to most of the houses that were in the new town. The new town, they'd started to construct it in the 1760s, and that was where the rich of the old town went to live after its construction. That was the place to be. The beautiful houses and crescents that are still there today. And of course, everybody who was anybody wanted Brodie furniture in there. So he had the keys because his apprentices, his workmen would go in there to construct these beautiful pieces of woodwork. So it was no problem to get into these houses. He took 3 accomplices with him. He took a man called George Smith, who was his locksmith for the company. Always handy to have a locksmith around when you're breaking into people's houses. And he took a petty criminal with him. called Aubrey. I'm not certain of his surname. And he took a man called John Brown with him. Now, John Brown was an Englishman, and he'd come to Scotland because he'd fled the prison hulks on the River Thames. They were the floating prisons that they would keep the prisoners until they were ready to be transported out to that new prison we had in the middle of nowhere called Australia. So he had a transportation order on his head for 7 years. So he fled that and he came to Scotland. So they would enter the premises of these places very stealthily, and when people reported that they'd been robbed, they said it was like thieves coming in the night, because sometimes it might be two or 3 days before you realise you'd been robbed, because they were very clever and they'd take things that wouldn't immediately be noticed. So the master of the house might say to his wife, "Let's get the silver soup tureen out tonight, darling." And when the maid went for it, or the housekeeper went for it, it was missing. Now, like all petty criminals, they always, or hardened criminals even, they always dream of the big one, the big heist that they're going to pull off that means they'll never have to do this again. And Brodie was no exception to this rule. And he had big ambitions, and his ambition was to rob the excise house. The excise house at the time was down on Chesil's Court. It's still there today. Today it's flats, has been for a number of years, well over 100 years. But that was where all the revenue that was collected from the good people of Scotland was kept. So him and his accomplices went in the night. They had the key because, huzzah, they had actually been building some bookcases and things in there. What do you know? And made their way in. But they were disturbed by somebody that was coming home, a very, very conscientious young clerk who had come to collect some work to do at home. I say he disturbed them, and they scattered to the 4 corners of Edinburgh. They met a couple of days later and realised that the heat was on, because there was a reward going to be gone out, because the people of Edinburgh were absolutely incensed by this. It was one thing to go and to rob the rich in the new town, but totally different kettle of fish when you're taking the money that has been given by the hard-earned Scots. So the authorities put out a reward for the capture of this gang, because they knew it was a gang. That's the young lad that went to collect his work said that there were several people. And the reward was £150, which was an enormous amount of money in those days. It's thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds today. But also, if you were part of that gang and you gave them information that led to the capture yourself, then you would be immune from prosecution. And this was a capital offence at the time. You would hang. So, of course, you've got a man in your gang of robbers who has got a 7-year transportation order on his head. What's he going to do? He's going to give you up, isn't he? So that's exactly what happened. He went to the authorities and dobbed them all in. They arrested George Smith, and the other guy got away, the accomplice. And Deacon Brodie made his way down to England. He was intending to get to the United States via Amsterdam, via the Netherlands, on the continent, as we used to call it. So he managed to get across to the continent, to Holland, where he laid low for a while, waiting for a suitable ship to take him to the United States. But in that time, his photo fit, what we'd call it today, his mugshot was all over Edinburgh in a drawing. And a merchant that had been trading, doing some business in Amsterdam, recognised him, and when he got back told the authorities that he was in fact in Amsterdam. Now, they'd already clocked that he was in the Netherlands, because Deacon Brodie started to miss his women. And so he wrote to them. He didn't put an address on them, but of course the mail had come from them. Of course, they were pretty fed up with him. They'd left him with these children, and by this time they'd found out about each other. And so this huge manhunt went across with this merchant that had said that he'd seen him and had a drink with him in a tavern in Amsterdam. So what happened was, apparently the arrangement was that he would invite him for a meal in his tavern again. Hi, I'm the guy that you hooked up with last time, let's have a meal together. And then the authorities would pounce on him and immediately arrest him. Whether they actually jumped out of cupboards, I don't know, but they arrested him. One of the very first extradition orders were put into place, and Deacon Brodie was brought back to Scotland for trial. Trial was in September of 1788. Him and George Smith did trial together and found guilty and sentenced to hang. And they were due to hang on the 1st of October in 1788. And the scaffold at the time, the public scaffold, was on the Royal Mile, right opposite where the Court of Justiciary is today, and the statue of David Hume, if you've been to Edinburgh. And a huge crowd, over 10,000 people had gathered to watch this execution, and it was a complete theatrical experience. Brodie did not look like a man that was going about to meet his maker. He was blowing kisses to the ladies down below, and he was being deep bows. He had his best suit on, all past powdered wig, cracking jokes with the executioner, the hangman. And there is a legend born out of this that his father, or his family rather, had arranged for him to have a steel brace put around his neck, which went through some contraption round to his waist, that when the drop came it wouldn't break his neck, because we were into the long drop system now. Of course, that is absolute rubbish, but a wonderful little story. In fact, at that time, his family was so ashamed of him, they'd scratched his name out of the family Bible. And when you're in Edinburgh, if you go to the Museum of Edinburgh, you can see that family Bible and his name very clearly scratched out. So back to the execution. I think basically the reason he was behaving like that was because he was a showman. He was very flamboyant. It had all been a bit of a laugh in some ways, even though he needed the money. It was the crack, as my Irish friends and colleagues would say. He knew the jig was up, and he was going to go out with a bang, with a flourish. So the hangman placed Smith and Brodie onto the trapdoor of the gallows and pulled the lever, and nothing happened. There was laughter on the scaffold, and people were getting very edgy down below, thinking, what's going on here? What's going on? Because they couldn't quite hear what was being said, what the big joke was. Second time, happened again. For the third time, Smith and Brodie, who had thieved together, died together as they were launched into eternity. And the big joke? It was the Brodies that had built that particular scaffold, hoisted by your own petard. Now, I was a young boy years after the execution, going into the early parts of the 19th century, that was absolutely fascinated by this story of this man that could have, in essence, two lives, different one in the day and another completely different one at night. He came from a wealthy family, this young boy, and what fueled his curiosity was the fact that when he did his homework, his schoolwork, he did it sitting at a desk in his bedroom that was built by the Brodies. And you can see that desk for yourself if you go to the Writers' Museum in Edinburgh, which is where I like to tell this particular story, because that young man became a very famous author. And he eventually did get down the story of William Deacon Brodie. It was Robert Louis Stevenson, the man that gave us wonderful books like Treasure Island and Kidnapped. He got it down in a book. The Strange Affair of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was born. So when you see that play, read it, read anything about it, have a little think back and about what I told you about Deacon Brodie, because without him, it would never have been that inspiration for Robert Louis Stevenson, one of my personal favourite authors, to have actually got a similar story down. A man that took a potion to change the way that he looked and how he behaved. So I hope you've enjoyed that wee story of Deacon Brodie and its connection with Robert Louis Stevenson and Jekyll and Hyde. It's been lovely to tell it to you. It's a story that I do quite often tell on tour when you're with me. And next time you see me, I'm going to tell you about another connection. This connection is about a clergyman in Paisley and his connection with a very, very famous university. Back with you in the United States of America. So until then, take care of yourselves. Be cool, stay distant, I should say, and keep safe. See you all soon. Bye.